guys, welcome to Top Psych Tutoring. Today I'm going to be going through BOCCHIARO study, which is the second study of the social area in the OCR A-level spec. I hope you guys really enjoyed this video and you're able to use it in your upcoming revision or mocks. Now we're going to discuss the context of the study because it's really important in remembering the background details and in also answering the 5-mark context question on the exam. Now, previous studies, such as Milgram study, didn't consider the individual characteristics alongside the situational factors which may have influenced the participant. What I mean by this is that Milgram only considered the authoritative figure and his demands and how it influenced the participants to make certain choices. So, for example, to shock another person. Now, even though BOCCHIARO's study is based on Milgram's research, it also considers the individual characteristics of the participants, and they do this through personality tests, which I'll mention later on. BOCCHIARO's study also provides a chance for the individual to take action against the unjust authority, and they can do this through whistleblowing, and that is one of the main factors of the study and how it differentiates from Milgram's. Now, the aims are to investigate rates of obedience,
disobedience and whistleblowing in a situation where no physical violence was involved, but quite clear that instructions were ethically wrong.
the accuracy of people's estimation
Of obedience, disobedience and whistleblowing in this situation.
dispositional personality factors in obedience, disobedience, and whistleblowing. The method and design is quite questionable because it's a lab-based experiment, but it's not necessarily a lab experiment itself. So it was conducted in 2 lab rooms of VU University in Amsterdam, but not a pure laboratory experiment due to no IV being present. The sample is a self-selected voluntary sampling method recruited by flyers posted in the university cafeteria. Now, there were 2 groups. There was the experimental group and the comparison group. There were 149 experimental group undergraduate students, 96 women and 53 men, with a mean age of 20.8. They took part in exchange for $7 or course credit. Because they were university students, they would see course credit as quite valuable, and that's why this was one of the incentives. There were 11 participants removed from the initial sample due to suspiciousness about the nature of the study. So they were removed to kind of ensure that there were no extraneous variables such as demand characteristics, which may have arisen from them knowing what the study is about. Now, the comparison group. You may think, why would you need a comparison group in an experiment like this? They were basically given a hypothetical scenario of what the experimental group would go through, and there were 138 different participants from the same university. They were asked, what would you do, and what would the average student at your university do? The procedure of the study is quite short and quite good to remember. We first have the instructions, decision making, action and debriefing. It's very important that you remember it in 4 sections because it allows you to remember all the details and ensures that you have the sufficient detail that you need for exam questions. Now we have instructions. So the participants were first informed of their task and the benefits, risks of participation, and their right to withdraw at any time without penalty. They were also assured of confidentiality. So in comparison to Milgram's study, it was quite ethical, and you can mention this as a comparison point. Now, the male Dutch experimenter had a stern expression and was formally dressed, just like the picture on the left. Now, this reminds me of how Milgram and how the authoritative figure, who was called Jack Williams, was also dressed and acted in similar ways. So that's a way you can remember how the experimenter acted. Now, he met participants and requested them to provide names of fellow students who they would need to persuade to participate in an unethical study on sensory deprivation. The statements would be sent by email. So they were then, of course, told to make decisions. The participants were told that the University Research Committee were evaluating whether to approve the study and were collecting feedback from students. They were told that the RC forms, the Research Committee forms, were in the next room, and the experimenter left this room for 3 minutes to leave them to reflect. Now, the next step was participants were moved to the second room for them to write their email on the computer to persuade their fellow student, which should be enthusiastic by using adjectives such as superb, incredible, great, and exciting. Any negative effects were not to be mentioned in the email. Now we go into the 3rd section. In this same room, the second room, if a participant believed that the proposed research on sensory deprivation violated the ethical norms, they could anonymously challenge it by checking a box and putting a form in the RC mailbox, which stated the following. I'll let you guys read that, but it basically states how the participants should be protected from psychological harm when contributing to any type of research. Now, of course, this presented the fact that the experiment was very unethical and it would cause harm to the participant. So, debrief. After the 7-minute interval, the experimenter returned and invited the participant to follow him back to the first room, where she was administered 2 personality tests, the SVO and the Hexaco-PIR. They were also probed for suspicion, so for example, if they found out the motive of the study, they would basically be probed for that. They were fully debriefed and asked to sign a consent form, this time fully informed. Now, if you remember, they did sign a consent form at the start of the study, but because they didn't know the actual motive of the study, it couldn't be informed consent. They were debriefed, and this was conducted with great sensitivity, and they were also informed of the reasons for deception and the true nature of the study. Experimenter made sure that the participants did not feel uncomfortable about their performance, so for example, being obedient, disobedient, or whistleblowing. Here are the 2 personality tests that we mentioned earlier. We have the SVO and the Hexaco-PIR. Please do use the full word of social value orientation in the exam, just to get the full marks. Now, the SVO measured the extent to which values are orientated towards benefit for all or themselves. So in other words, it measured how selfless or selfish a person actually is. This was measured through hypothetical scenarios and how much points a person allocated to themselves and other people. The results categorized participants into 3 types, being pro-social, individualistic, or competitive. Being pro-social meant that you'd maximize outcomes for yourself whilst maximizing outcomes for others too. Being individualistic meant that you'd only maximize outcomes for yourself. Being competitive meant that you'd only maximize outcomes for yourself and minimize others' outcomes. So in that sense, you'd be selfish. Now we have the Hexaco-PIR. It involves 60 questions, which measured 6 personality traits with 10 Likert scale questions for each. It measured honesty and humility, emotionality, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and openness to experience. Now, it involved 10 Likert scales, which meant that it was measured from a scale from 1 to 10. Before discussing the key findings, it's really important to know how participants were classified. So we have obedient, whistleblowers, and the disobedient. Now, the obedient complied and wrote the statement that the authoritative figure provided. The whistleblowers reported the experimenter's questionable conduct to the RC by ticking the box on the form and placing it in the mailbox. There were 2 types of whistleblowers. There were open ones who openly disobeyed the original request of writing the statement to their friend, so they openly defied the authority figure and whistle blew. There were anonymous ones who complied and wrote the statement but also submitted the form, so obeyed the experimenter but whistle blew behind the experimenter's back. So the anonymous ones ensured that they were conforming to the demands, but they also complained and couldn't openly and confidently do it in front of the authority figure, maybe because they were scared of the outcomes or the consequences which may arise. Disobedient, those who refuse to write a statement. That's quite explicit. So on the right, we have the results of the experimental group. There were 76.5% of obedient participants, 114. There were 14.1% disobedient, and there was 9.4 whistleblowers, 9 anonymous and 5 open. You may remember the comparison group when we were discussing the method and sample of the study. Now, I know it's really hard to remember 2 samples, but how I remember it is that the experimental group had 149 participants and the comparison group had 138. So if you take 4 take away 1 and also 9 take away 1, it's 3 and 8. So that's how I remember 1 through 8. That's how many participants were in the comparison group. The comparison group were told about the hypothetical scenario of what the experimental group went through. So they were told, if an authority figure told you to persuade a friend to participate in an unethical study such as the sensory deprivation study, what would you do? And 3.6% of this sample said that they would obey to the authority figure's demands. 31.9% said they would disobey to the authority figure. And 64.5% said that they'd whistle blow. They were also asked, what would the average student at your university do? And 18.8% said that they'd obey, 43.9% said that they'd disobey, and 37.3% said that they'd whistle blow. Now, the personality test basically measured the individual differences in personality. They found that it did not influence the performance of participants. However, there was a correlation between those with higher faith in religion and a whistleblowing attitude. Now, this means that an individual's characteristics can guide their morality and that the situation didn't have as much of an effect, but this is only a small correlation. This leads us to conclude that behaving in a moral manner is challenging to people, even when this reaction appears to observers, the comparison group, as the simplest path to follow. People tend to obey authority figures, even if the authority figure is unjust. Now, this means that the situational side of the debate is being proven here, because 76.5% obeyed to the authority figure's demands simply because they were an authority figure. And it means that they dismissed any individual characteristics, such as their morality, in comparison to the authority figure's demands. The difference in the rate of responses between experimental group and the comparison group reflects the general belief that most of us think we are above average and guided by moral principles. How individuals say they will behave in a situation differs from when they are experiencing it. Now, this really shows how important it is to conduct this kind of research, rather than simply relying on research in which participants are given hypothetical scenarios and asked about what they would do. So this is really helpful for future researchers and ensuring that they are giving participants a real situation and allowing them to experience the authenticity of it. I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, but qualitative data was also collected alongside quantitative data, and it was really insightful because it allowed us to see how obedient participants, the one who complied with the experimenter's demands, justified their actions by allocating the blame and the responsibility to external forces, such as the authority figure. So they said, "It was expected of me, that's why I continued, and I cooperated because the experimenter wanted me to." Now, if we look at the disobedient participants, they remained fully responsible of their actions inside the lab. They stated, "I don't want to do unethical things. I would be very disappointed in myself." So all these defiant participants seem to make the comparison between the external demands and the internalized moral standards. And of course, moral standards won against the authoritative figure's demands. Now, for whistleblowers, they felt like they had to decide on which authority to obey, the one making the unjust demand, the experimenter, or the one who would disapprove of their actions, their conscience. So they said, "I did not want to have harmful consequences weighing on my conscience, so I felt obliged to do this." Now, what all this explains to us is that behavioural acts of disobedience and whistleblowing are psychologically and socially demanding. We know this because there were 76.5% of obedient participants, and the rest were disobedient and whistleblowers. So that meant being disobedient and whistleblowers is really difficult compared to being obedient, and it really explains how the situation, so the authority figure, really influences how a person acts. We're on the final stretch, guys. Now we're going to evaluate the study. So the first strength is that it had a high control of variables. The procedure was standardized, which allows the study to be replicated, which increases reliability. So if you think about all the factors which were used, so for example, the same experimenter was used, the same cover story was used. So for example, the unethical experiment was the same. And the high control of variables also means that there's less demand characteristics and the participants are not able to discern the motive of the study, and this increases the validity. Now, there were males and females, which means that it wasn't androcentric. Androcentric means when a sample is filled with men, and it means that it's not representative of both genders. But of course, because there were males and females, it wasn't androcentric. This means the final analysis could consider whether there were gender differences in disobedience. And I'm sure there wasn't. Quantitative and qualitative data. Quantitative data allowed a percentage of participants who obeyed, disobeyed, or whistleblew to be determined. Qualitative comments made by participants during the study and debriefing were very useful in understanding why they acted how they did, and it also provided evidence for the situational side of the debate. And lastly, the right to withdraw and debriefing. They were not forced to continue at any point of the study, and they were thoroughly debriefed at the end of the study, which means ethics was a very important strength. So the first weakness of BOCCHIARO's study is that it was low in validity. And you may think, how is this possible? Because there was a high control of variables, and this increased the validity. However, the personality tests such as the hexacle pi R and the SVO may have not been testing the appropriate characteristics that the researchers wanted to find. So, for example, the participants may have given socially desirable answers, or they may have not been truthful in the personality tests, which means that there's low invalidity and we can't actually know whether or not their individual characteristics really influenced the choices that they made. The second point is that they also lack generalizability because there was a sample of university students only who may have been possibly more proactive than others in protesting unfair practices about a certain institution. Now, there's also the point of deception. We know that the study is quite ethical in regards to the right to withdraw and debriefing. However, the participants were deceived because they were told that researchers were seeking help recruiting participants for an unethical study and were required to get this past an ethics committee. Now, we know for a matter of fact that they weren't testing this and they were only testing the obedience and disobedience of participants if they were told by an authority figure to carry out an unethical act. The last point is I also lacked ecological validity. When people whistleblow, they are employed by the organisation they are speaking about, and so the consequences of their actions would be greater. So, for example, if me and you work at a place and we know that there's something wrong going on there, but we're employed by the organisation, we may be more hesitant to whistleblow because we might think our job might go, our money might go, and I think that's a very larger consequence than what was in this study. In this study, they were given the course credit or the $7 prior to the study, so they had nothing to lose. So, to what extent does this reflect real life decisions and how a person would act in a real situation? Thank you guys so much for listening. I really hope this video helps, whether that be in your revision or your upcoming mocks. So, thank you so much and take care.